Hello and welcome. Apologies to those that have already had me say all of this once, but it's lovely to see you all here, and it's a great opportunity for us to celebrate 10 years of the museum and the modern studio being open. And this morning we got to hear about the people involved in saving the pottery and some of the interesting stories behind how they had to go about fundraising and sorry, no, that's all right. You know, how it all happened really, and it's a really nice opportunity for us to have a little bit of time to reflect on what seems like recent history, but actually, you know, time is marching on, and if we don't capture these things, yeah, we might not have much details of especially the early years of the pottery starting. So that's really nice. A couple of housekeeping things, if you haven't heard this already. There's no fire alarm planned, so if the alarm goes off, please go back the way you came onto the street. Toilets are downstairs, there's tea and coffee in the back, please help yourself. And we'd like this to be very much a kind of open session, so feel free to ask questions and get involved. And yeah, on behalf of the pottery, thank you very much. I'd like to introduce Simon Olding, who's the Chair of Trustees and also the Director of the Craft Study Centre in Farnham, and he's going to introduce and chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Debbie, and it's wonderful to be here today. As Debbie said, we had a session where we reflected on the kind of founding history of pottery and the kind of the extraordinary achievement of bringing these really complex things together in one place. This is the moment where we can reflect on what I think is called, theoretically, the fledgling years of the pottery and absolutely locate that in practice. And we have the most stellar panel in order to help us do that, to talk through the issues about doing that very complicated thing, which is what you do when you've got this thing called the Leach Pottery, and it's your responsibility with this lovely studio which has been built for you. What is it that you're going to do? I'm really thrilled that Jack Doherty is here. I met Jack a long time ago. I've admired his work. I've even bought his work actually from Ceramic Art London. I've sat on panels with him, and we met, I think, actually only about this time last week, actually, I think, at Ceramic Art London, where I could hardly get a word in with Jack. His stall was so busy. I just reflected on that. I was doing a lecture on the history of the CPA, and I found some wonderful photographs of Jack, both as he is now and in earlier years.
No, I wonder where it was.
Yes, no, well, you look terrific. I'm just going to, I think the format of this, we're going to try and keep, relaxed. It's very important that you engage with the panel. I've asked Jack to start off, if he would just reflect on this great moment, this pivotal moment of how, as a very distinguished potter, studio potter, what he was going to do, and then to hand it over. But first, perhaps you can introduce your team, and then we'll hear from you about those issues of starting up the practice. Okay, thank you.
This is the thing. Instruction and technology really important. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Thank you for taking time away from the sunshine and St Ives to be here for this. And I want to start with a little bit of personal reflection, really, back 10 years, and 10 years sometimes seems like forever, and sometimes it seems like 10 minutes. But to January 2008 really was when I first started work at the Leach Pottery, and remembering very, very clearly why it was that I had to get up at 4 a.m. to leave home, to drive, to be at St Ives for 9 o'clock in the morning, January, you can imagine all that. And to arrive in a place which through my life has been significant in one way or another. As a student, as a younger potter, the Leach Pottery has always been there in some form or other, in some way or other. But to arrive at this iconic place, to walk through the door of a brand new purpose-built studio and put my suitcase on the floor and look at this space and think, my God, what are we going to do with this? I was at a split second moment where I thought, okay, you can get back in your car and go home. That's one approach. But the other was, well, hey, this is exciting. It's terrifying also, but it has an enormous amount of excitement and creativity attached to it. So that was, I mean, day one was literally walking around the place, discovering that we had a studio which had beautiful stainless steel sinks, it had underfloor heating, it had double glazing, it had all of these amazing things built there, and an empty space to work with. But of course, before that, I mean, there were months when I was thinking about this project. I had known about it for some time. And the question really was, what happens now? Because, of course, you heard this morning of how the funding was raised, how the building was built, how all of those things happened. And yet, we were at a point where it now had to change from one thing, from being a restoration project to being a pottery, and a working pottery in a culturally important institution in full view of the world and the ceramics world in particular. So, before I had left home, I had been talking to a friend of mine, and he was a scientist, and he's the sort of guy who asks very straight questions. And he said, you know, okay, when you leave the Leach Pottery, as you will, some point, what would you feel that you'd like to have achieved with that? And the answer, after thinking a long time, I felt I want there to be good pots being made at the Leach Pottery again. That was a single, simple, refined answer that I could give myself. And that was my starting point, really, for all of the things that happened after that. The building had been built. We needed to do things like we needed kilns, we needed various things, we needed equipment. And the first discovery probably really was that while the pottery had been equipped with electric kilns for students to use, there was no provision made there for any other type of firing. So I had to find a space, a bit of car park, and to ask the contractors to lay a concrete slab for the basis of the kiln site. That was done. We then started to build the shed and then the kilns. This happened, I think, within 2 or 3 weeks of my coming down to the pottery. The idea was, in my own sense, that if we had kilns, we could make things. If we didn't have kilns, we were doing nothing. We were kind of just hanging about. We could wheels would make work, but the kilns were essential. And with it coming there, of course, as any potter, any other potter would do, you bring with you your own interests, your own knowledge. You bring there what you know and what you can do. And I'm a soda firer, and it seemed to me that this way of working would fit quite closely and quite well with pottery in the past, with the ideas that Bernard had about using clay and about using kilns. So the plan was then to go right ahead, lay out and build 3 kilns. One which would be a production kiln for the studio. The second would be a kiln for the apprentices and other potters to use for other things. And the third was a kiln for me to make my own work in. Now, a bit of context here really, because I arrived in St Ives equipped with a contract for the first time in my life and a job description. And the job was this: it was a 3-day-a-week job. I was to be the lead potter of the new studio. I was to design, quote unquote, a saleable range of new work to be made there. I was to carry on with my own work in the remaining time and to, again, quote, be an inspirational focus. Inspirational focus. No pressure, really. So they were the things that were kind of being condensed into a 3-day-a-week job at the time, which also had connections with education with the University of Falmouth, with working with the gallery, helping to kind of curate exhibitions and stock work in the shop. So there was quite a mixture of things attached to arriving in St Ives at that point. But the kilns were the essential point at that time. We actually got cracking. We built 3 of them with Joe Finch's help in a week. And I had discovered at that time that there had been no planning permission granted for the kilns or the kiln site. and had one of my first decisions was to, well, what do we do now? You know, I mean, do we apply for planning, just wait for 9 months until planning permission is given, or do we go for it? Realising that Cornwall Council were actually our landlords at the time, it seemed unlikely that they were going to refuse this. But we went ahead, we did it, we applied for retrospective planning permission later, which was quite easy then to achieve. So, at the same time I was buying equipment, we were building shelves, benches, kitting out this beautiful new empty space we were actually turning it into a pottery in some ways. And it took, I'm guessing, probably maybe nearly 4 months before we had the kilns in operation, which involved doing all of the things like providing gas, doing all of the technical stuff to them. And we had a great team. The guy on the left is a man called Michel, who was a hotelier here in St Ives, and we had a meeting one night when I first came of volunteers, and lots of people were saying, yes, I'd love to help, what do you need? I said, I need somebody with a chainsaw and a pickup. And Michel put his hand up and came around the next day with his pickup and trimmed the trees around the kind of kiln site and cleared the space. And he became one of our biggest helpers really during that time. He was there, always available, always had the man with the right tool for the job, didn't he?
He was a resourceful man.
He was, and he knew everything really about it. And this is the kiln that I built to use, a copy of the kiln that I've been using for a number of years. And quickly realised that when you come here into the Leach Pottery, nothing is done in private. You know, imagine you start off pottery and the Times and Echo had a feature, first firing at the Leach Pottery. Okay, so we did that, and and it was really a test, Frank, because it was a testing of some of my own pieces, really, to kind of just simply because I knew, I was pretty sure about what might be happening or not during it. But we had that, and of course we had the obligatory open kiln session where everybody came and viewed the mistakes or otherwise at the time. But again, you know, for me, the extraordinary change in working environment, because I moved from a place where I'd been for 25 plus years, on the edge of the Forest of Dean, surrounded by oak trees, to firing in a car park on the edge of St Ives, surrounded by people who wanted to know what was happening. And that in itself really was both challenging and it was inspiring in different ways, because it's not often at my time of life or my stage of career that you get an opportunity to kind of start in a different place in a different way, and to kind of have a clean slate, if you like, to kind of work with all the pressures of that. Now, coming to the pottery, of course, pottery was new and empty, but my life wasn't new and empty, because I was bringing a kind of practice that was in progress. You know, I came with commitments, I came with exhibition plans, ideas, things to kind of carry on with. So that in itself had to be juggled and kept going at the same time as starting the new studio. And the way of making, I mean, if you're not familiar with it, soda glazing, it's a development of the very traditional salt glazing process. So instead of using sodium chloride as a glazing agent, we use other materials like sodium carbonate or sodium bicarbonate. And the idea really is that this ingredient is sprayed into the kiln at high temperature, and the sodium reacts with the silica that's in the clay itself to produce a glazed surface on work. A very natural, very direct, very spontaneous, very engaging kind of process. And some of the first things, a variety of different things that we'll see how, we can see later how that has actually changed and evolved in 10 years. Now one of my other major jobs really was to design or to come up with a range of work that would be made by these guys and by everyone else at the pottery, a range of pots. And it seemed to me to be crucial that this work shouldn't simply be a pastiche of work that was made in the past, that it simply wasn't copying glazes, forms, shapes that were made previously, that it shows some of the qualities of what Bernard Leach would have been interested in and a contemporary sense or a contemporary feel to it. So it belonged in kitchens today. And I looked, of course, at how this was done in the past. I looked at the things that David Leach had written and talked about at the time. And I looked at the forms and the shapes themselves, and I was seeing things like porringers and egg bakers and soup jugs and so on. All of them in their time, important things, but that's not what we need. It's not what we use now. We deal with other things. We have pasta plates and we have espresso cups and we have all of these other kind of objects. But the idea then was to kind of come up with some forms that would actually then reflect that sort of idea. And also, I think that what an important element really in the thinking about the table was that it would be made not always by me, but by other people who were coming to it from a different place, from a different skill set, who were in some ways learning to understand what it's like to produce a quantity of wood. So there was that element to it. And these were some of the shapes. I moved from a place where I'd lived for 25 plus years that had everything, really. It had studio house, it had a collection of studio ceramics that I'd built up over a long period of time. And I moved to live in a flat in St Ives, which had nothing, literally, an empty space. And in that sense too, I sort of started again with a kind of a life that was kind of coming from a new place. And I thought about what it was that I needed to have in that little kitchen, whether I needed plates. I needed plates, not particularly a lot of plates, but ones that would fit together, bowls that would stack inside each other, things to drink from, cups and all these pouring things. And that's what the basic set of forms came from. And the idea behind them, there were a couple of things. I read one of Bernard's comments, not quite one of his one-liners, but he said, I want to make pots that show the nature of the clay, which seemed to underpin a lot of the things that I had been thinking about in my own work as well. The nature of the clay itself not covered, but having some of its kind of quality showing through in the finished work. And paraphrasing Yanagi's comment about don't live with anything which you know not to be beautiful, something like that. In other words, living beauty in your daily life was a sort of fundamental part of the thinking behind that. So there were things that were simple. They connected back to those early thoughts in a very very precise way. They weren't about glazes. They weren't about copying decorations or painting or those things, but right back to the kind of basics of the ideas. And I added to that. And the nature of the fire, which I think was the thing that we allowed to be the final completing part of these things: the firing, the soda glazing, the reaction with flame and vapor, without any added painting or any other decoration. So a few of the things. You still hate these handles because they were. The idea really was that they would concentrate making it in a way so that you were doing the minimum, but you were joining them in a particular way. So the little joints and the little kind of angles and the shape of them were kind of tricky enough to kind of repeat and do it. You can get them right a few times, but it was difficult. So that carried on, and to my knowledge, I think it was successful. I've only kept two emails back from that time about the table. One was from a Japanese lady. She was the editor of the book The Unknown Craftsman, Bernard's book about Yanagi. And she wrote from Japan, and she said, I think what you've done is fantastic. I think that it reflects the nature of what the pottery was about, but in a contemporary way. Another one was from Jeff Astrike, who was apprentice at the pottery, and he sent me down saying, you've done a stellar job of designing the tableware. There were the two comments that I kind of held on to as being justifying really the kind of work at that point. But also making my own things. I'm, as I said, a soda fire, a soda glazer. I work with porcelain, and I make vessels. And these were some of the early things that I kind of made just literally in my old studio in Herefordshire before I came to St Ives. They were from some of the last firings that happened, and it's actually quite interesting. There's a sort of sequence that Matt has cleverly put together that shows these early pieces plus some of the new ones a bit later on. Vessel forms that I connect with living, with life, with the spaces people live in and the way that people live. I look at old pots, I look at prehistoric pots. I wonder how it is that these things were used in the past, how they connect with people in not just this life, but in other lives. And I make these forms that are in a way simple, but they survive a hard life. Someone described these pots as being survivors at one point because they go through a rigorous and a very harsh kind of making and firing process, where the kind of sodium again attacks them and etches into the surface. And I set up situations in the kiln where the sodium is again going to connect with them in very direct, very spontaneous sort of ways. And I think about space too, and I think about home and how we live, the way we live, the places where we live. And I make work sometimes for particular places, both at home and elsewhere. And sometimes outside. Now I think that's my last image, really. But I think that there's a sense there of how the work has kind of grown, changed, evolved, developed. From the time of the pottery to the time, the present time. So, I don't know about questions. Do you guys want to have questions at the end, or would you rather have them?
Let's have a couple now.
At the end of each section, and then we can.
If there is any.
So, if anybody has any questions on my section, I'm really happy to.
Have you Northern Ireland roots?
Say
Have your Northern Ireland roots
my Northern
got
Ireland.
anything to do with what you do?
Yeah, of course they do. I mean, that in itself is part of who I am, because I mean, there's an hour's conversation around this one really. We did Sarah and I did an exhibition at St Ives 2015 called Waypoint, where we used you might have seen it, but we used the chapels and we used the fishermen's lodges as ways of taking work out into a community. I'm from a family of fishermen. My family were fishermen on the north coast of County Antrim. And coming to St Ives again was like, in a way, the end of a journey, because I came from one coastline up there right down to this one. And when I first came to St Ives, every day I would walk around the harbour. I lived up so between here and the pottery, top of the hill. I would walk every day around the harbour, and I just wanted to see what was happening. I wanted to see who was going out, who was catching what the deal was, what was going on. And it kind of really took me right back to that connection with the sea and with the kind of cycles of the sea and of a fishing community. So Waypoint was a show that really hit into that, and we actually connected with this town in a way that was nothing to do with art or with craft, but through a different way. It was amazing to talk to people who we met both in the chapels, the St Nicholas and St Leonard, and in the Rose Lodge down by the harbour. We were coming in and discovering ceramics in these places, and some people didn't notice them really. They weren't expecting them. Some people were kind of quite offended, like, why you put that thing in the window? But there were a lot of people also really seeing work for the first time, and its connection with the environment, with the stones, with the granite, with kind of this bit of corner. So yes, Northern Ireland roots are kind of always there.
Do you ever change you have one slip that you use? I think over the years, have you ever slightly modified the slip, or do you just modify the firing itself?
It's two things, Michel. For me, for a long time, the idea of stripping away what I thought was unnecessary was very important. So I've done a lot of work over the years, kind of slips, clays, colours, coloured clays, but stripping the process down to using one slip, one clay, one slip, and one firing. So I don't do any biscuit firing, everything goes in the kiln just once, and then the kind of soda firing happens around that. So yeah, I have modified that slip, and just recently I've been trebling the amount of copper that's in there, really just to kind of extend the range of the colour from those kind of, from the blues, yellows, through the blacks and very rich kind of dark sources. So like, you know,
You're intensifying it now.
intensifying some of the colour, yeah. I'm again changing the firing because I do a sort of an in-between firing, whereas people would talk about either making oxidised or reduced parts. I do both in the kiln, so I reduce heavily for a period, oxidise for a period, and then repeat that sequence. So it brings a lot of different colour from copper.
I have a question which is not about making, but about the development of the studio. And where did people come from? You know, how quickly did they get recruited, and how quickly did it grow?
Again, somewhere I have all of these things stashed away. They're going to find away. But from memory, I think it would have been probably autumn of that year of 2008 when we had. Is that roughly right? Autumn.
We came for an interview in summer.
In the summer, and then you started. And
We started in
yeah,
September.
that's September. That's right. So what we did, we trawled around. We advertised through the networks, through the CPA newsletter, through I think we had Astronomy Review and various things. And I think if I remember, there were two interview days. You came and you did a little bit of work with us, didn't you? You kind of worked in the studio, and we talked about that. And then you started work in September. And at that time, we had just about got the studio together. The kilns were sort of working okay. We didn't have any clay recycling facilities for a very long time. I mean, I bought the equipment from.
That was me.
Was that? Yeah.
I was the recycling man.
Well,
I had to do it with my hands.
I know, but just think how good that's been
I
for
know,
you.
it's good. I got a good technique for it.
Yeah, and we were building up a mountain of reclaimed clay on the side of the pottery that suddenly became an eyesore, didn't it? It was huge. But then we found that was the last piece of the network of the equipment that kind of was put together, kind of proper clay reclaiming. So yeah, about September, autumn of that year. So in between times, getting the place ready, making shelves, building kilns, trying things out, and just trying to make an empty space into a pottery, really, which was the basic idea. So if you've no more questions, I'd like to introduce you to Jacob Bodilly, who was, and you guys came together, didn't you? You started on the same day, so I can't say you were the first one or you were the second one, but
No.
you were jointly the first apprentice who kind of came
Yeah.
together for the pottery. I'll give you that.
Thank you.
I think
That's me.
that's you.
Thank you very much for coming to listen to me as well. I think this is a great picture because we just opened the kiln and it was a joint firing. Me and Michel fired it together, and it was we were having a cup of tea and we were probably quite tired, and yeah, we were quite happy, I think.
Yeah.
We were quite happy with the results. We were really interested to see what would come out of that kiln.
Was this one of the ones you fired to about Con 12 or
It was, yeah, it was.
1350? I think.
We fired the reduction kiln, and I think obviously the standard ware was being made soda fired, and Michel had come from a reduction glaze, you know, the more Chinese style glazes, and I was more interested in the soda firing. I'd come as a student and I wanted to make soda salt fired work, and Michel had come as more into the reduction glazes. So I would put pots into his kiln and I'd put them into the soda kiln, just to, and then I'd fire Michel's glazes in the soda kiln as well, see what happened. Put a Temuka in there and melt it all off. paints all over the brand new kiln
Then a
shells.
dedication brand new kiln shells.
We did destroy a few kilns.
Yeah, we destroyed stuff.
You said that, I didn't say that.
No, it's fine. You know, poor Jack. Poor Jack had to deal with us. And me and Michel are quite, you know, we're characters. And we're both quite driven individuals too. And we sort of turned up and we had quite a strong idea of what we wanted to do as individuals, but also we had to build a team quite quickly, and it was an honour to be accepted as a student. That's the way I felt, and I felt like I had to honour that with my body, with my service. You know, I had to make that standard where, and I wanted to make it. I really wanted to make it well.
Can I just say something here that I hadn't mentioned earlier, really, which was the way that you came to the pottery and the arrangement that you guys had in the early days, because I think that the funding plan for the pottery meant that the idea was that the workspaces were being rented out to young potters. In other words, when you came here, you had to pay a rent, a monthly rent, I've forgotten, maybe £200 or thereabouts, without any provision being made at the time for kind of earning money at the pottery. And I think that one of the things that I did at that point was to try to eventually, as the standard rent production increased, to make the point where you were being paid for the work in some form or other that you actually made, that at a minimum level would pay that rental, that rental fee, and beyond that then you had the opportunity to make your own work or to make extra work. And I think that probably it took right through your period of the pottery to get that beginning to work, because of the kind of idea that, you know, we kind of start with a new range of pots, making it, sorting the technical problems out and selling enough of that to make it kind of financially viable back into the system.
Yeah. That's after the Leach Pottery, so I don't think it's not really relevant at the moment.
Just Basine.
Yeah, that's Basine.
Tell us a bit about that. Tell people about
Okay,
Basine.
let's go. Oh,
One more.
I like that picture there. I like the goggles. Yeah. We had fun. We really had fun. We really enjoyed it.
At times we had fun.
No, you didn't.
There were times when some people
We had fun.
and some people were fun here.
And you were trying to get it to work. And we were just like, yeah. You know. Yeah, I'd just come out of university and I was very, very sort of full of energy and full of enthusiasm for pottery, and I'd done all of that art school stuff and I didn't have to make concepts anymore and I could just make pots like I always wanted to do. I always wanted to make pottery in traditional style, and it's very sort of purist in a way. It's sort of a bit, it's easily criticised, but that's what I'd always wanted to do anyway, ever since I started doing pottery. And finally I got to the Leach Potter, the Mecca, and I was there and I was really proud to be there, and proud to be there as a Cornish person as well. You know, that was linked to my heritage.
You often talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was important to me, and the reason that I'd come to there and now go and link into Basine pottery, which is where I went afterwards. My grandparents used to buy pottery from this pottery, Basine pottery, which had been set up by Leach Pottery apprentices in the 60s. So this was part of the community of St Ives, St Just, Penzance even, Newlyn potteries that were around in the 60s. And this was the history that I was linking to, and that I was interested in becoming part of a lineage in a way, to carry on some of those more intrinsic Cornish traditions, sort of unashamedly, and I wasn't trying to make anything new. I was trying to carry on some of that tradition of the not Leach Pottery tradition, more the ethos, the traditional ethos. There we go. So when I went to Bodilly Pottery, and Scott Marshall, who had been Bernard Leach's last apprentice, had died, and he passed away the first year we got to Leach, which was very sad, because he was sort of one of the last living Cornish apprentices that had worked with Bernard Leach, and that was, he was part of the lineage, and he had died. So I was asked to go out to Bodilly and finish his last work, which was quite an honour, but it was also, I knew, there was quite a lot of weight on that project where I had to finish a sort of master's work. It was a lot of pressure, but I wanted to do it. So, and that was when I left the Leach, because that was a new project for me. After 2 years, I was at the Leach, and I sort of made quite a bit of the standard ware.
Yeah. What do you think about 2 years as a time scale for that? Was that enough? Do you feel that you could have done more, or
I think
do you feel it in yourself that was the time that you felt you should be moving?
Well, I don't know. I guess I don't really think like that. I thought, I believe in destiny. So it came to that day,
Right,
and that seemed right, and there was new people coming into the pottery, and it was all filling up a bit, and I was sort of expanding as an ego and a personality, and I probably felt like it was a good idea to go into the wilderness at that point, which I did.
Jim, can I say something? Because I bought a mug of yours at that time,
Yeah.
just before you left, in fact several months.
Yeah.
And I remember being struck at you, having worked as a university lecturer for a while and so forth, and aware of this process of students going on and reaching stages, and I just thought, this guy is about to leap. And you were talking about leaping out, and you obviously, you come, it seemed to me, you come to fruition.
Yeah.
And you feel the next stage beckoning you,
Yeah,
jumping into it.
I was finding it difficult to cope with the sort of structure of it all. I was really wanting to,
Well, it was
get on my
positive.
own.
Yeah.
It was very positive.
Yeah.
It was like, I sort of felt quite confident.
No, I remember that time well, because what I was trying to do, desperate, was to impose some structure in this place. Do you know? For the reality of doing it. And then you were developing it to a point where that wasn't what you needed, it wasn't what you wanted anymore to be.
That's what I mean. I feel like it was a natural ending to my time there. Had I gone on, it might have stagnated slightly. But at the same time, I was sad to leave, and I lost all the good bits of being at the Leach, like the nice kilns.
Yeah.
I didn't have a good kiln. I had a broken kiln. All of a sudden, I had a broken kiln, and it was like going back in time. Really, it was like.
But brave thing to do, and
Yeah.
you used the word leap, didn't you, at the point? And I feel that when I came to tonight, I did the same thing. I had to take a leap. I had to kind of decide that I was going to land softly at some point,
Yeah.
but it's that moment of deciding and saying, yes, I can do it.
So yeah, I mean, there's this picture on the screen. This is the shop at Bodilly Pottery, and I filled it full of. You can see the mugs are very sort of based on the old traditional ones, and people really love them. I mean, I don't make them anymore, but at the time people were really happy that someone was making these old shapes, and they're like, oh, we can go back to the pottery, and it was all very, very lovely actually. And I started to develop some of the other areas of my work, like the teaware and the finer work. And I just had all the freedom in the world all of a sudden to make what I liked, to make what I wanted to make, and practice in private. As you said, it wasn't very, you know, the Leach isn't a very private place. You're on show all the time. The public come every day and they're watching you make things. And all of a sudden, I'm in a cow shed in the middle of nowhere, and it doesn't matter what I make because nobody's going to know unless
People did come.
They did come, but you know, I was there just.
But it was
in
a time warp.
nowhere.
It was a wonderful place because you'd refurbished it to its former glory and added to it. And I'd come to visit you, and it's just off Cape Cornwall. And you'd be in there, you had a piano, he'd be composing his own music, you'd come in and you would just tell people, there's a bottle of wine, there's some coffee, you just, you know, whatever, and you'll keep playing. It was wonderful. It was, you know, there'd be paintings there too. It was
This is why, you know, it came to a natural end at the Leach Pottery. Because I had to hide the bottle of wine under the kick wheel. Yeah, but it was very bohemian. It was very bohemian when I went here, and I lived in a tent for a bit. It was just mad. I mean, but there was a lot of work to do initially. I had to dig up all these old kilns that were buried under the ground in an old mine shaft, and it was mad. You know, and all the pipes were like coming out of the ground and broken, and it was. I loved it because I think that's part of the Cornish way of doing things. It's like, yeah, it's a bit broken, but you know, it's fine, really. You know, just keep muddling along. There's some jugs, but I copied some of the Bacillian pottery traditional shapes, and I carried on that tradition. But at the same time, I made my own work alongside it. So people could come in and get the traditional shapes, and at the same time, through making those, I was learning and paying my respects to that tradition, which I don't do that anymore. I just felt I had to do that at the time because the loss of that tradition was something maybe that hurt me spiritually. So I felt like I had to pay my respects through making those works and not even emulating them, but saying, yeah, I've communed with that, and that's going to feed into me and into my path as an individual maker. So it's quite sort of it's you know, I wasn't sort of taking in inspiration and thinking about my own work. I was literally making that work, and that was inspiring my work by making that work. But I don't define myself by making that only. So this is when I set up my new pottery after I moved back to Devon, because unfortunately the owner of Bacillian Pottery passed away after 4 years, Beth Marshall, and I had to move. I had 3 months to move, and I found an old farm building in Devon, and that's where my family live, and I didn't have any money, so I moved back to my family and set up this thing in an old cattle shed. This is the first couple of firings I did whilst I was there. You can still see a couple of the sort of older shapes, but you don't really see those shapes anymore. This is old. This is so old. It's really embarrassing. So this is the tea ware practice of Chinese tea, gong fu cha, which means the art of brewing tea well. Kung fu is the art of doing things well. Gong fu is the same. Kung fu, gong fu. And cha is tea. Gong fu cha, the art of brewing tea well. So that's been a sideline of throughout my practice ever since I got to the Leach and I met Michel and he introduced me to Gong Fu Cha. I started dabbling in tea ware to the point where now I make it as part of my professional work. Whereas before we just made things to use for ourselves, and you know, that was I don't know. There, that's good. That's a good picture. So this teapot on the right hand side is called a Kyuso, and it's a traditional shaped type of teapot that you'd get in Japan. A lot of people look at it and say, why has it got two spouts? And then when you tell them it's a handle, they sort of understand. But in Japan, they made teapots with these side handles, and they're actually a lot easier to use than the handle on the back that sort of cricks your arm when you pick it up. Whereas if you've got it on the side, you just twist it like this. So it's very Japanese in that sense, where the design is zen. You don't have to stress to make
It took you a long time to actually get the right angle, because it's a very specific angle.
Yeah. The angle of the handle relates to the size of the pot and to the spout and to the weight of the pot as well. And you're supposed to be able to pick it up with one hand comfortably and turn it like this. And every time I make them, I pick them up and I go like this, and I go, it's not good enough yet. But the bigger it gets, the further away the handle gets from the spout. Because when you pour it like this, then it pours the tea straight like that. So the tiniest one would be this big.
You spent many years on the teapot.
I did.
I think you're still spending a lot of time making teapots.
Yeah.
You take it very religiously.
But also behind you, you've got a Japanese antique kettle for brewing the tea, and every single one of those pours immaculately.
Not like that Mino potter. You remember that time when the Mino potters came to the Leach Pottery,
Yeah.
and he made that teapot that they pour. Remember?
Yeah.
It's not an easy
No,
thing
but
to make a teapot, and
everybody-
you can be a great potter. That doesn't mean that you make a good teapot.
Every potter's nightmare is a teapot, and it's my nightmare as well, because I make teapots that pour really badly, as well as I do. They're all I've thrown them across my car park in rage. They are annoying. But if you get it right, there's something really satisfying about it. You can even make a copy of that Japanese teapot and it still won't pour properly. It's that annoying, it's that tedious at times. It's like, come on! Why don't you work? But it can work. It can work!
Michel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the third panelist, of course, is Michel, Francois.
What images have you got? It's like lucky draw.
You've seen them before. None of us have seen pictures.
So you just kind of have to improvise. So that's me brewing tea at the Leach Pottery. On the right you have that little teapot made by this rock star Mino potter. That was a really nice guy. He decided to make a Gyokuro cup for us, and then we were very impressed by them. And then when they left, we decided we'd fire it and brew it, and then we got the finest Japanese tea, and then we had this little ceremony, and then it just poured all over.
So we felt better,
So we felt a bit better about ourselves.
Did we email them and tell them?
So,
That's a nice picture.
what, that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, we did spend a lot of time talking about philosophy and why we make things and what responsibility we have as makers. And we were very inspired by The Unknown Craftsman and the Potter's Book, especially the first chapter, which is Towards a Standard. And we were really trying to figure out what the reasons behind making, and also the value of what do we put into an object and why. And so values like sincerity, grace, functionality, but also it has to have this sounds slightly religious, but you imbue a little bit of yourself into what you make. So if you're making and you're listening to Mozart or something, that will actually feed into what you do. So clay is it captures, it's got energy and it's got memory. So your attitude towards what you do and the reasons why you do things, they're important. So we did have lots of conversations about that. And rather than...
but that relates to the part where Bernard Leach says the pot is the man. But it's the same, the man is the pot. You see the character of a maker, you see the intent, the skill, everything. You see that in their work. And that's what he meant by the pot is the man. So that's sort of it. We
were trying to figure things out.
Yeah, we were just talking a lot about these issues, and these conversations could go on for weeks.
But at the same time, we didn't just want to be kind of Leachian potters, just kind of like fall into that, just making. We didn't want to copy Leach at all, but we were very interested in what the underpinning philosophy of that was behind it and being infused, but then actually you have to kind of oxygenate that in your own way rather than just being plagiarizing. And that's what Jack did in his own way when he did the range, and we were doing it in our own way as well. So it was quite exciting to have lots of conversations, but also to see things being done, being inspired by, but more in the spirit of things rather than just kind of plagiarizing.
So to kind of get the Leach off your shoulders, so to speak.
Yeah, re-understanding it and making it fresh for you, and it's just how can you bounce off that, and how can you get fed by that? But you're doing your own cooking. You're not going to just follow the recipe. You're going to make your own path and your own way. You're going to take it for yourself. Because actually, Yanagi and Leach, I think, were quite interesting characters, and they were very modern for their time. I mean, it's kind of like the English eccentric. Yanagi, when you read The Unknown Craftsman, 95% of it is wonderful, 5% of it is almost fascistic. But it's still it's
of its time as well.
It's of its time, but actually it was, it is an important turning point in, the idea of looking at the whole of humanity and saying that, a headdress from Native American Indian or a medieval jug or a Japanese pot all have value, and the idea that humanity is present in the object, that was rather an important thing. So
it was quite complicated.
Yeah, it was quite intense.
So how do you think
it was quite complicated?
But it was. I mean, can I say something? But I think that these discussions are still. We still have these discussions on the phone
all the time.
This is the narrative of the work that we do. It doesn't end. You don't get to an end point and say, "Oh, I'm finished now." You're always aware of different subjects, and those you could sometimes come all the way back to the books, and you say, "Oh yeah, I remember that. What did that mean?" Again, now I'm mature. Now I feel like I've finished. How does it relate to me now? And that's why I think those books are so interesting and powerful, because they don't actually run out of meaning ever.
I came from an art background, so I did 10 years as a sculptor. So you can see some sculptures in the background. I already had, so when I came to craft, it was a big steep learning curve for me. I didn't have as much throwing experience as Jacob. I was thrown into, it was quite challenging for me to be at the Leach. At the same time, I came through a different perspective, trying to understand what it meant to be a craftsperson, but coming through an artist. So it was very humbling, but at the same time, I was an artist trying to be a craftsman. At the same time, I still an artist. You're very much of an artist as well. You're a composer, and he paints music, he paints pictures. So we're kind of artist craftsmen rather than just plainly craftspeople. So we kind of had questioning what it meant to be a craftsman and how art and craft dance together.
I think it's come the other way. I think I've moved towards being an artist, but I felt like I was trying to be a craftsman first, whereas you'd studied art and sculpture, and you came and you've come the other way, and that's why our friendship has been so powerful, because we were always on opposite sides of the thing, and as we connect over a subject, we've always got a different. Sometimes it's a shared perspective, and sometimes it's a I don't know.
Yeah. What's really interesting about the conversation you've just had is it makes me think about Leach, Hamada and Matsubi actually having probably the same sort of conversation
Yes.
in about 1920. That's very useful.
Could I say also that,
Yes.
I've been working with Jeremy Leach for a couple of years, and Jeremy has this sort of dialogue with everybody over coffee. I think echoes what his grandfather was doing, and you feel the tradition coming through. And listening to you two, it's exactly the same thing. I think it's wonderful to see that carrying on so alive. It's great.
I think it's great that that it's not. I'll start that again. I think for me and Michel, we've come into it not as part of the Leach Pottery family, and that's what makes it different, because they're sort of expected
it's more
to.
structure.
They can't see it from an outside perspective.
That's right.
Whereas we're actually very critical. If they say if Leach said something wrong, we'll be the first people to be on it and be
I see that. Yes.
No, sorry.
Yes. It's alive now, though. That's the thing. That you are alive. It's not that it's something that's created. It's that he was doing it, you were doing it. But what it is not necessarily Leach. It's this conversation around pots, which is
That's the important point, actually, because what a lot of people do is they copy Leach because they think that he's
God.
or they think, oh, what he's saying amounts to what he's making, but that's not true. Actually, what he says allows you to make your work.
Yes.
But it has a sort of ethic involved, and if you just blindly follow Leach pots,
You're going to,
it's not going to work, is it?
Okay, well we've got about 4 poetical moments left before we bring this to a close. So any questions from the floor?
Oh. We've said everything.
Okay. No, there we go. Thank you. Yeah, there's a question.
I've got a question. So, you guys have worked really closely together. Have you ever had moments of competition or friction, or has that conversational thing, been...
We had one last night.
Worked?
I was banging the table going, listen to me! And he was going, la 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 la.
Your question depends a little bit on who you include in the conversation.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure
Yeah.
that we managed to make things happen. Obviously, there were times when there were conflicts of different sorts.
Definitely.
Which is inevitable, really, given the kind of complexity of the situation. But, thinking back, really, to those times, we achieved a lot in a very short time. And I think that you were talking about Hamada, you were talking about Mr. We started the pottery in the same way that those guys did, in a contemporary time, but we did everything that they had to do, from finding clays to making kilns work, to kind of finding work that people would buy to keep the place kind of going and moving, condensed into a couple of years or less.
I think that was the job that you had was massive. It was like the start of the Leach Pottery, brand new equipment. What are you going to do? And you were thrown into the gauntlet of what is that new standing room going to look like, and some people loved it and some people didn't like it.
Exactly, but that's inevitable. I think that you've got to remember that I wasn't thrown into a jaunt. It was my decision to do that, and to be there, and to take responsibility for all that stuff. And you're right. We did what we did.
Yeah, but it's always going to be difficult to start that process again, because it's already got a history.
Yes, yeah.
It's already got a heritage, and there's going to be some people that say, "What are you doing?
Well,
Why are you
of course-
making it like that?" And there's other people that say, "Oh, thank God they're doing it."
I've always believed that tradition it can be dynamic and creative, and it can't always not a burden necessarily, but I think you've actually got to be able to see it in the right kind of way.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think this is the moment for us to pause. With 3 potters here who have left, thought, and made, and done an amazing thing. So would you join me in thanking Michel, James,